As Donald Trump's incompetence and inconsistency continue to devastate the American economy and the stock market, he's once again publicly lashing out at the conservative Wall Street Journal, whose editor-in-chief triggered him this morning with an interview conducted by MAGA Fox News host Maria Bartiromo, and we have to talk about it. But before we do, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, it's a day that ends in Y, which means Trump is once again punishing the American economy and the stock market and lashing out at even principled conservative critics, including the Wall Street Journal, which is owned, is a sister company, a sister business of Fox News. So this is what he said on Truth Central. The globalist Wall Street Journal has no idea what they're doing or saying. They're owned by the polluted thinking of the European Union, which was formed for the primary purpose of screwing the United States of America. Their Wall Street Journal thinking is antiquated and weak and very bad for the USA. But have no fear, we will win on everything. Egg prices are down, which is not true. Oil is down, interest rates are down, and tariff-related money is pouring into the United States. The only thing you have to fear is fear itself, which, if I recall, is a quote by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Very different man than Donald Trump. Again, just an entire tweet, screed, an unhinged rant replete with lies. But what triggered him was this interview this morning the interview was conducted on Fox News Business by MAGA Fox News host Maria Bartiromo, and she was interviewing the Wall Street Journal's editor-in-chief. And this is about a 2-minute and 30-second clip. We're going to play the whole thing and unpack it together.
And we saw each other at the World Economic Forum in January.
Yes, in Davos, right?
In Davos back then. And do you remember the mood then was so upbeat? And the American chief execs that were there were all so excited. The talk was all of deregulation, growth, no tax rises, boom, boom, America. And Europe was absolutely stuck in the doldrums, very unhappy. But it's very interesting how that mood has shifted pretty much since all the tariffs started coming in. I think businesses realizes now Trump is serious about this. But the problem they've got is that they're being imposed in a very haphazard way, and that's creating so much instability. Then along comes your interview, and Trump refuses to rule out a recession. He's talking in a kind of no pain, no gain kind of way. And I think, chief execs, businesses, they're slightly floundering because they don't know where to look now.
Yeah, and one of the main stories in the Journal today, CEO frustrations with Trump over trade mount in private. So the president has been speaking to lots of CEOs this week. He was at the Business Roundtable, and of course, lots of CEOs told me at the Business Council they're not sure where things are going. What do you think the conversation is in boardrooms today in terms of how these companies are going to adjust to this new policy of tariffs?
Well, I think one thing's very clear from our reporting is they're reluctant to say anything publicly. I think that story that is about this roundtable of business people. There were some sort of informal polls where the chief execs that were there said the stock market would have to drop by 20% for them to talk out. So I think they've accepted that the tariffs are here, and what they want to know now is which ones are staying, which ones are going to be dialed back. Is there going to be further retaliation? And I mean, just before I came on, there was news that Trump is now talking about further retaliation against the EU. The EU,
and we'll talk about that in a separate video, but that is also coming to fruition.
Retaliated yesterday against the aluminium and steel tariffs. Trump's now talking about putting 200% tariffs on champagne, alcohol, core European products.
So do you expect that those prices will go higher? I mean, when a company has to pay more for its input, will they typically pass it on to the consumer, do you think?
I think eventually they're going to have to.
Yeah.
They may not immediately. There may be some buffer there that they can absorb these prices. But over time, inevitably, I think we will see prices for certain goods go up.
And again, just note, right, both this editor and Maria Bartiromo are desperate to defend Trump. Now, the Wall Street Journal goes to not quite the same sort of extraordinary lengths that Maria Bartiromo will, but even the question, like, do you think it's almost like asking 2 + 2, does that equal 4, do you think? Like, in your opinion, well, of course it does, right? It's just economics 101 that even laymen understand, myself included, which is that tariffs are ultimately paid by the consumer because companies don't want to absorb the hit to their profit margins, especially when the particular tariffs are so sweeping. Again, it's not like a 2% tariff, a 5% tariff. It's a 25% tariff, or in some cases a 50% tariff on all imports from our biggest trading partners. So yes, it is inevitable that these companies will pass the price on to the consumer. And Maria Bartiromo, and yes, even the Wall Street Journal, they wish that they could come up with a way to defend Trump's agenda here because they don't want a liberal administration. They don't want a progressive administration. They don't want Democrats to be back in power. But this is where we are. So I want to look at a couple of articles here from the Wall Street Journal since we're talking about them. Maria Bartiromo cited this particular article in question, which you can read a bit of it. How business leaders talk about the Trump administration in private has been markedly different from what they are game to say in public. The dissonance was on full display here this week. Early on Tuesday, dozens of corporate executives and others assembled at the Yale CEO caucus not far from the White House, just as news emerged that the Trump administration planned to potentially double tariffs on steel and aluminum from Canada. Those in the room responded with a mix of groans and shocked laughter. Quote, "There was universal revulsion against the Trump economic policies," said Jeffrey Sonnenfeld. You know what? I'm going to have to increase the size on this. Sorry. Even with my glasses, I can't read that far ahead. There was universal revulsion against the Trump economic policies, said Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, a professor at the Yale School of Management, who organized the invite-only summit that included corporate bosses such as J.P. Morgan Chase's Jamie Dimon, billionaire Michael Dell, and Pfizer's Albert Bourla. Quote, "They're also especially horrified about Canada." That sentiment wasn't apparent hours later when many of the same chief executives from Yale attended a question and answer session with Donald Trump at the Business Roundtable. There, the exchange was largely cordial, and the executives didn't ask the president any pointed questions about his tariff strategy, according to people with knowledge of the event. Some business leaders have cited the need for stable approach to policy. So, quote, "Swinging from one extreme to another is not the right policy approach," Chevron chief executive Mike Wirth said to an energy conference in Houston on Monday. Quote, "We have allocated capital that's out there for decades, and so we really need consistent and durable policy." So again, this is part of the article that Maria Bartiromo mentioned. A couple of other articles to look at here, again, kind of in relation to this. CEOs don't plan to openly question Trump. Ask again if the market crashes 20%. Again, this is something that the editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal mentioned during that interview with Maria Bartiromo. Oh, and this is actually, okay, so it's the same article with a different headline, okay, as the article that we were reading there. Couple of other articles to make note of from the Wall Street Journal. Again, a reputable conservative publication that is unabashedly pro-Republican, pro-conservative, and therefore inclined to be pro-Trump, but they'll also criticize Trump if they think he's going to ruin his presidency and ultimately the American economy. So one such article, for example, is basically a call for people to sue Donald Trump over his tariffs. Trump's tariffs are no emergency. Trump invokes a law that doesn't give him power to impose sweeping tariffs. Someone should sue. That's how desperate the Wall Street Journal is to save Trump from himself. The Constitution gives power over trade to Congress, which for most of the United States history wrote tariff law. That changed after the catastrophe of the 1930 Smoot-Hawley tariff, as Congress said, "Stop us before we kill the economy again," and ceded authority to the president to negotiate bilateral trade deals. It ceded more power after the Second World War. Trump now has the explicit power to restrict imports, but only for specific reasons. The president may impose tariffs on imports that threaten national security, Section 232, or in response to, quote, "large and serious balance of payments deficits, a surge of imports that harms the U.S. industry, and discriminatory trade policies." During his first term, Trump used Section 232 to impose tariffs on steel and aluminum and 301 on goods from China. Trump's executive orders are imposing 25% across-the-board tariffs on Canada and Mexico, and 10%, now 20%, on China. Instead, invoked the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which gives the president authority to address, quote, "an unusual and extraordinary threat," if he declares a national emergency. So, and it goes on to basically make the case that they think that what Trump is doing is unconstitutional and should be sued to stop him since he won't stop himself. Another article the Wall Street Journal's editorial board recently drafted was, "Will there be a Trump recession?" And it goes into the increasingly common indicators indicating that there may be a Trump recession. But I want to quote kind of the very end of the article. All of which suggests slower growth ahead even if the economy dodges recession. Trump's deregulation and extension of the 2017 tax reform should buoy business investment over the long term. Of course, again, remember, these guys are not liberals. They are not progressives. They do not want a progressive tax policy. They want a conservative tax cut for the rich, deregulate as much as possible policy. Again, just to remind you of who this is, okay? But the higher costs and uncertainty caused by his tariffs are hurting the economy now. If Trump wants to quiet recession alarm, he would be wise to put his tariff plans on the shelf, which he's not. Another article, how do you like the trade war now? basically mocking Trump about the Canadian response, the Canadian pushback that he's receiving. Trump wanted a trade war with the world, and Americans are getting it good and hard. Stock prices continued to decline on Tuesday amid the latest U.S.-Canada tariff tit for tat. By the end of the day, the two sides were talking about a temporary truce, but who knows which side of the tariff bed Trump will wake up on Wednesday. And again, it goes into the back and forth there, and the many potential consequences of Donald Trump's brutal, painful, and unnecessary trade war. It also calls out Howard Lutnick, Donald Trump's Commerce Secretary, because he's kind of the point man at this point for trying to defend Trump's slapdash, haphazard, hot and cold tariff policy to the public, and it's proving disastrous so far. It also calls out the the cowardice of elected Republicans in the continuing resolution that they recently passed. Continuing resolutions, of course, being a temporary government funding bill, which the House Republicans, by the way, said that they didn't want to do. They didn't want to do temporary continuing resolutions. They didn't want omnibus funding bills. They wanted to do line by line, unit by unit funding policy, and they're not doing any of it. They're walking back on all of it for a continuing resolution, even though they control the House, they control the Senate, and they control the presidency, and have a 6-3 conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court, but they can't effectively govern, so they are defaulting to a continuing resolution, which more or less keeps the spending levels as it was under President Biden. And we've been assured by Republicans for years, and even in the past several months under Donald Trump, that the Biden agenda, the Biden budget, is replete with waste, fraud, and abuse, but they're wanting to continue it for several months. Interesting. They're, of course, unprincipled hypocrites and dishonest losers who should be made fun of. And the Wall Street Journal, in this article, calls them out for including legislation in that continuing resolution, which would prevent the House of Representatives from voting to suspend Donald Trump's trade emergency. They basically voted to disarm themselves against Donald Trump. Why? Because they're cultists, because they have a humiliation fetish, because they're worried that the Democrats could, retake the House in the midterms, and they potentially want to gum up the system because they want to, preemptively, unilaterally disarm. But that's basically what they're doing. They know that Donald Trump's tariffs are economically unstable, wildly unpopular, and they would technically have the power in the Democratic proposal in this continuing resolution to allow themselves to override Trump's trade emergency, which empowers so many of his tariffs. And they've effectively said, no, the only way we're going to pass this is if we, in advance, give up this power. And the Wall Street Journal calls them out, the abdication of their responsibility. But there you have it. Again, this is a company that is a sister company of Fox News, owned by Rupert Murdoch. And Donald Trump is once again publicly triggered. He's lashing out at them for daring to criticize. How dare you criticize me? With your principled arguments and your arguments that are well-grounded in fact and history. How dare you do that? You're supposed to bend the knee, like most MAGA Republican politicians and like most MAGA Republican constituents. But the Wall Street Journal has yet to do so, and I imagine we'll see continued ongoing beef between Trump and the Wall Street Journal in the days, weeks, and perhaps months to come. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.